Oh, what a guy. Well, welcome to this episode 2 of St. Ignatius of Loyola, Getting to Know Him. You know, ever been or visited a culture where sometimes they do this to get your attention? Psst, psst, psst. Hey, psst, psst, psst. They would do that a lot in Nigeria sometimes. I'm using that as today's acronym to learn a little bit more about St. Ignatius of Loyola and this Jesuit to whom he dictated the spiritual exercises. So what was the name of this Jesuit? His name was Louis Gonzalez de Camara. Louis Gonzalez de Camara. You can remember it with a camera. But he had a very close sort of relationship with Ignatius, being able to have the vantage point of hearing all about his life. So I use an acronym PSS to talk about his viewpoint on St. Ignatius. So it won't be in this order, but the P is like a procrastinator. Oh my gosh. A spiritual director, the first S, a sickly one, and a storyteller. Psst. Procrastinator, spiritual director, sickly, and a storyteller. So Louis Gonzalez de Camara tells us that there was a day he was walking around in the community and St. Ignatius was kind of out in the orchard. And Louis de Camara started to kind of think about his life and examine his conscience. And then he became very aware of this kind of recurring sin that he had in his life. He called it vainglory. And so when St. Ignatius came into the house, he told him about this. And he mentions that St. Ignatius listened to him and then he shared words with him that so consoled him and even filled his eyes with tears just because of this spiritual conversation that he had with St. Ignatius. St. Ignatius even went as far as to tell Louis de Camara that he himself had dealt with this particular fault for 2 years in his own life. Isn't that a consolation to us that sometimes, we may be struggling with some fault? Our saints, just like all of us, are imperfect. We're in process, right? Still under construction. But St. Ignatius so consoled him and told him that one thing he can do to overcome this vain glory, sort of this excessive obsession with yourself and pride and yourself and your achievements, he told him, diligently try to refer everything that you do to God and just remain humble, remembering all the gifts that God has blessed you with. So amazing. Ignatius, this great person who listened, who helped people, who brought consolation to his own brothers. So that's Ignatius as a spiritual director from the perspective of Louis de Camara. Now, after this conversation, Ignatius kind of went away, recollected himself for about a couple of hours, and then he came back to dinner with Louis de Camara and some other Jesuits, and he mentioned, you know what? Suddenly, I've been thinking, Nadal, you remember Nadal from the last session? Nadal has been asking me to do something for a while. What is that thing? To write his autobiography, right? And he said, now that he really thought about it, after this experience with Kamala of giving him consolation through his own experience, he said he felt a certain kind of devotion and a strong intent built in him by God to do this. And so he had decided that day that it will be Louis Gonzalez de Camara who he would dictate this autobiography, the story of his life, too. Amazing. So Louis de Camara also notes that oftentimes, St. Ignatius would be a bit sickly, and so when he would hear people in conversation saying, you know what, after 15 days, I'm going to do this, and then 8 days later, I'm going to go here and do that. Ignatius would always say, like, how can you be assured that you are going to be able to do that? Do you know if God is going to give you a life for all this time? And Louis de Camara says that he was really kind of sickly, not being kind of promised life sometimes from day to day. But what he hoped was that God would give him maybe 3 or 4 more months to be able to do this bequeathing of how God had worked in his life with Louis de Camara, or through him, to the Society of Jesus and to the world. Well, in addition to all the busy occupations he had, he kept kind of postponing. That's why I called him a procrastinator. He kept postponing, Louis de Camara would ask him, can we begin? And he would postpone, and he would postpone. And then things would happen, like a pope would die, and he would say, well, we need to be praying right now. And then they elect another pope, and he would be so busy. So I put in procrastinator, right? But at one point, I think it was September of 1553, he called Louis de Camara, and he began to tell about his life until he got to Manresa. Well, in other episodes, we'll learn a little bit more about that. Well, and then his occupations took him up again and again. But Camara does describe how St. Ignatius dictated and told him about his life, the little that he had begun. He said whenever Ignatius would talk about his life, he did it in such a vivid way, it was as if you were actually there with him, present to the event, that Louis felt that he didn't really have to add anything. Like, he just kind of put down exactly what he heard from St. Ignatius. That what was hard for him was sometimes not being able to kind of give the forcefulness of some of his points and some of his expressions, right? To be able to do that for the people. And here's a little tidbit. This is a kind of strange rule in the Jesuits at the time. But while Ignatius would be pacing around dictating the autobiography about his life, Louis Gonzalez de Camara would always want to look at his face to see him, to see his face. Apparently Ignatius would say, remember the rule. It looks like there was a rule that you would not, be staring, I suppose, at the face of your superior or at the face of your brother. But anyway, Louis got so carried away several times, he would go and try to look again, and it got Ignatius a little bit upset, but eventually he continued to dictate the autobiography, to tell about the journey of his soul. So we get a little bit better picture of the life of St. Ignatius from the perspective of Louis Gonzalez de Camara, who got to spend so many days with him, hearing from him. Now, with all the interruptions, the autobiography actually took maybe a couple of years eventually, with all the interruptions, to get done. But thankfully now we have it. And as Nadal urged Louis de Camara, keep pressing our Father to finish this autobiography, because by doing this, he would truly be founding the Society of Jesus. Because once again, we who are members of this Jesuit family would have a pattern and a testimony of how God worked in the life of Ignatius, and how the Spirit invites us to be open to God who is at work in our own experience, in our own stories. That guy. Well, this has been episode 2 of St. Ignatius of Loyola, Getting to Know Him. Look out for more episodes next week. AMDG. Blessings.